Chapter 7. Saturday afternoon. Doreen sniffed at Mac's shock and drew herself up to her full height, wrapping her mantle of disdain around her and said, "It's not hard to make. It's just lemons and sugar water." His lips twitched, but he said meekly, "I'd love to try a glass of lemonade." So she pulled out the pitcher from the fridge and poured him a glass. And then she waited, hating the expectation that it would be awful to his taste buds. But he looked surprised. "This is good." "Don't sound quite so shocked," she said dryly. He chuckled, pleasantly surprised. "You're getting better. I've hardly cooked anything. You're the one cooking. Which is why we'll eat spaghetti tonight," he said, "but you're making it, not me." She put the lemonade back into the fridge. "What do I need to get started?" He stood beside her and said, "Pull out the ground meat, the celery, and the onions. The garlic is on the counter already. We'll need fresh tomatoes too. Do you have any of that red wine left?" She shook her head. "I don't think so. It would be vinegar by now if I did." "Good point," he said. He got out the big pot, and per his instructions, she learned to brown the ground beef, add in the onions, the celery, and all the spices. And then finally the chopped fresh tomato. He grabbed 2 spoons, gave one to Doreen, and he dipped his in the sauce. She was hesitant but sampled her sauce. "It's good," she exclaimed. "Of course. Now we'll let that simmer," he said. She sniffed the top of the pot and said, "Wow. I really hope I can remember this." And then he pointed at his phone. She looked at it and said with a big grin, "You videotaped this, didn't you?" He laughed. "I did, and I can send it to you. You can have it for the next time you're making sauce. I would make pots and pots of this and freeze it all, so I have food for weeks. There's no reason not to, except for the fact that you don't have much freezer space." She looked back at the pot and sighed happily. "You're right. And I certainly can't afford to do this all the time." "It's a very cheap meal," he said in all seriousness. "You can afford to eat this at least once a week, if not 3 times. Just then her stomach growled. He glared at her. She raised her hands defensively and said, "I ate earlier, but then I've done several hours of gardening since." She motioned outside so she could show him how far she'd gotten. He looked at it in surprise. "It's starting to look really good. I'm a long way from being done though. I'm still trying to make sense of what's in the garden. Once I've done this side, I have to start on the other. And if I want to make a complete change in design, I need to put that down on paper." "What kind of change?" She motioned at the tiny deck and said, "I was hoping to bring that deck all the way out here, so it will be about 12 feet across. It'd be nice to have a little barbecue and a place to sit at a bigger table for a meal, not just that little tiny bistro set." He nodded and said, "That wouldn't be hard. Especially if you kept it under 2 feet high. You wouldn't need permits." At the sound of permits, her stomach sank. Permits sound expensive. They can be, and it also depends how far back the house is from the riparian zone. Her heart sank even more. Meaning, you might not do anything without a permit too close to the creek. I think the rule is 50 feet, or maybe 15 meters. He frowned. "I'll have to double check." He walked down to the creek by the property line and used his stride as a measure, then walked forward. He stopped about 20 feet from the house. "You know what? I think you could probably bring a deck addition almost up this far." She looked at the large space in surprise. "Really? And there's no reason not to if you want something that big. Although you don't really need to have it this big. Still, no basement windows or underneath that would be blocked, so we could make it a solid deck with a nice set of stairs coming down off to the side. You could have a patio down here too." She looked at how far he had walked. It was almost to where she had finished her weeding. We don't have to bring it out as far as the fence either, she said, studying Richard's fence. No, you need 6-foot clearance for that without asking for a variance, and there's really no need. We could put stairs down on that side too, so you could get to the flowers if you wanted. As a matter of fact, it would take a nice chunk of the garden out of here that you wouldn't have to worry about. He turned around, looked, and said, by the time you brought some topsoil in here and got this area sorted out, you could have a nice lawn garden on both sides and a big deck. I'd love a big deck, she said warmly. Something with that lovely outdoor furniture, lounges, chairs, and a table. If that's the case, maybe 20 feet isn't too far out. That is big though, and you have to count in the fact that the bigger you make it, the more money it will cost. She winced. It's the labor as much as anything. Then she stopped and said hesitantly, I was wondering if it was something I could do. He looked at her in surprise. It's not that it's hard, he said cautiously, but you have to get things level, and you've got to dig in your patio blocks. You know, those concrete anchors? You've got to put all the beams in, and that's not hard, but it does take a bit of work, as they are heavy. I'd be more concerned you might not be able to lift the wood. Oh. And if I can't do that, I can't lift those big concrete blocks either? The blocks aren't bad. It's the wood, and it depends if we'll put like 4x4s all the way from one end to the other, he said. I think the biggest length we can get away with is 12 feet without paying delivery, but that doesn't mean we can't do doubles. Right, Doreen said, as if she understood. I'll have to look it up. But I really like the idea of a big deck. I can see that. You spend a lot of time out here, so why not? It's not like you'll ever have a pool because of the creek, but you can certainly have a patio and a nice deck. Even an outdoor kitchen, depending on how much money you want to spend. Her jaw dropped at that. An outdoor kitchen? He nodded enthusiastically. Barbecue counter sinks. They're really nice. She nodded slowly. Did you consider the fact I already have one kitchen which I don't know how to use, so a second kitchen I don't know how to use is kind of redundant? He spun on his heels to look at her, then burst out laughing. She glared at him. I'm really not happy you come here to get your daily dose of humor. I mean, I guess the internet's pretty boring for you now. Inside, she was tickled though because she had meant it as a joke. And he had taken it that way. Oh, you're great, he said, as he swung an arm around her shoulders and tucked her up close against his chest, giving her a hug. Besides, you are learning to cook. You're the one who made that spaghetti sauce today. She thought about that, and a pleased smile crept to her lips. You're right there, she said. But a barbecue seems like it's even more dangerous than that electric devil inside. He still chuckled as he shook his head and said, some people would say barbecues are easier. I love barbecuing. Really? Really, he said. I know you probably have some maintenance you need to do on the house, but whenever you sort out the money from the antique sale, you might want to consider doing something like bringing in a gas line and putting in a natural gas stove or barbecue out here. It's easy enough to add a couple counters on either side and some cover overhead. You don't have to get too fancy, but I think that bathroom in the downstairs is right beside here, so it'd be nothing to bring out a sink. You'd have to redirect the wastewater into the sewer line. She kept nodding, as if she knew what he was talking about. In theory, she did, and the more she got caught up in his excitement, the more she could see the deck and how much potential it had. How hard is it to pour concrete? She asked. That stopped him cold. He winced. It's not hard, he said slowly. She glared at him. But we're back to the same problem, where I might not be able to lift the bags. He considered that and said, honestly, you probably could, and you could probably mix it yourself, but you couldn't spread very much at one time, and concrete is kind of fussy that way. But there are molds you can buy or maybe even borrow, where you can fill one mold at a time, if that's the speed you can work by yourself. You could even then have something like flagstones going all the way down to the creek and through the garden, depending on what you want. She nodded. It would be a lot cheaper to do it myself. You know how much it'll cost to pay somebody? It will cost a lot, he admitted. But first you need a plan, and don't cut your plans short just because you're thinking you can't do it all yourself. I might be able to come and help do some of the more physical lifting. Then he paused and moved around, studying the space in question. We can also bring in a cement truck, if we have all the foundation work done and the patio framed out already. It'll be a fairly clean and smooth patio and walkway. That won't be quite the same look though, and we do have to pay the truck to come. But then they can pour from your driveway here. At that, he motioned with his arms to the side of the garage. You know what? You could pour a sidewalk all the way down to the front of the garage, so you don't have all this nasty mess to deal with in here too. Doreen looked at the nasty mess where half gravel, half weeds existed, where things were growing and taking over. Potentially, Mac continued, we can somewhat pour it down near the creek as well. You can repair the pathway in the water areas. You can't add new ones without permits though. So, because a broken sidewalk is there, we can pour a new one? Mac nodded. Exactly. You can't add something new to a riparian zone, but you can fix what's already there. She walked down a few feet studying the broken pieces and then said, so what I should do is sit down with a piece of paper, draw something up that includes a large deck, the patio, and the pathways, then clean out this old mess because we can't pour on top of all that. I'm not sure how we frame circle pathways. It's not so much circles as much as curves, he corrected absent-mindedly. But you could have a path that meanders, or you could have a path that goes through the gardens and comes back to the center, or you could just have a nice path that goes right from here to the creek. That's where you walk the most anyway, isn't it? She nodded and said, and then just keep the gardens on either side as they are. And have a nice grassy spot on either side of the sidewalk. That would be pretty and elegant. It would be very simple. Adding the patio up here and a deck on top, I think you have a really nice space. What about a patio down at the far end of the riparian zone by the creek? If something's there already, he said, we could pour concrete. Otherwise, you just get some of those concrete patio blocks and put them on top of some of that gravel. That's not a problem. She nodded. Sounds good. I'll have to think about it. She walked back over and studied the deck. Any idea what it would cost to build this deck addition? Well, if you do it yourself. How about I do it myself, she said with emphasis, but maybe with your help? I don't know if we could get anybody else to help for a day or two. It's one thing to pay for a day's labor versus getting somebody in who actually does it from scratch. The thing is, I don't know where to start. I've built a couple simple ones, Mac said. And this is fairly simple because we're already almost at ground level, so we're just coming off the deck that's here. We don't have to worry about anything else but putting a railing on it, unless you want stairs all the way around so you can sit on them. She loved the idea of that. But that'll add more money too, won't it? He nodded. Railings are not cheap, so that cost may counter the other cost. She smiled. You know what? I'm really liking this idea. She hopped up onto the little deck, and already it felt claustrophobic. She walked back inside and he followed. She noticed the ring on the table in a plastic bag. She picked it up. You should put that into your pocket so it doesn't get forgotten, she told Mac. He took it from her, and his facial expression changed as he studied the ring. Are we thinking that's real? Doreen asked. He tried to hold it in the light, but it was seriously dirty. It looked like a solitaire diamond and one of some serious size, but it was almost too perfect. I think it's fake, she announced. I wonder, Mac said. It will need a good cleaning. It's been washed many times, she said. When you think about it, That garden has been watered time and time again." He nodded and went over to the sink to put a little bit of water on the ring inside the bag, enough to rinse it. And then he sealed the bag again. "I'm not sure if it is costume jewelry." Doreen shook her head. "I think it is. But a good one. Like one someone wore and kept the real one locked up. So good enough to not have the fake of it be noticed. I'd say that's at least a carat in size." It was a not too contemporary setting, with simple high sides and with a single diamond perched on the top. "That's a traditional engagement ring look. But the more I look at it, I can see how fake it is." Mac looked at her and she continued, "Look for an inscription. They're usually inscribed with something." It took a bit to get the lighting just right, because the band itself was fairly thin. "What was the woman's name?" she asked as she tried to look with him. "That's an M showing." "If it's who I think it was," he said, "her name was Meredith."